There is a moment, and if you have lived long enough with your eyes even half open, you know exactly the moment I mean, when something happens that shouldn't happen. Not in the sense of the miraculous, not in the sense of the physically impossible, but in a far stranger and more unsettling sense. Something aligns, something corresponds, something echoes across a gap where no echo should be possible. You think of someone you haven't thought of in years, perhaps decades, and within the hour they call you. You dream of water, of drowning, of a ship breaking apart on rocks you've never seen, and you wake to find that somewhere across the world, a vessel has gone down in the night. You find yourself inexplicably compelled to take a different route to work, a route that makes no sense, that adds 20 minutes to your commute, and later you learn that there was an accident on your usual path, an accident that happened precisely when you would have been passing through that intersection. These moments arrive uninvited. They do not announce themselves with trumpets or thunder. They slip into your life with the quietness of a leaf falling into still water, and yet the ripples they create spread outward into everything. Because here is the thing about such moments that the rational mind cannot quite metabolize, cannot quite digest and excrete and forget. They feel like something. They feel like meaning. They feel, if we are being honest with ourselves in the privacy of our own hearts, like messages. And the question that these moments pose, the question that lodges itself like a splinter beneath the skin of our carefully constructed worldview, is devastatingly simple. Who is sending them? What is speaking? And perhaps most disturbingly, what have we been failing to hear? We call these experiences coincidences. We have been trained to call them coincidences. The word itself is a kind of spell, a linguistic anesthetic that numbs the profound strangeness of what has actually occurred. To say that something is a coincidence is to say that it is meaningless, that it is the random collision of unrelated causal chains, that it signifies nothing beyond the brute fact of its occurrence. The word coincidence is how the modern mind protects itself from the vertigo of implication. It is a wall we have built, brick by linguistic brick, against the possibility that reality might be far more interconnected, far more intelligent, far more responsive to consciousness than we have been taught to believe. And yet the wall has cracks. The wall has always had cracks. Because no matter how many times we repeat the word, no matter how firmly we commit ourselves to the doctrine of meaningless chance, something in us knows better. Something in us registers these moments with a different faculty entirely, a faculty that predates language, that predates the construction of the rational ego, that may in fact predate humanity itself. Call it intuition if you like. Call it the unconscious. Call it the soul. Call it whatever name allows you to acknowledge its existence without threatening your membership in the Consensus Reality Club. But whatever you call it, this faculty recognizes synchronicity for what it is. It recognizes it the way a child recognizes its mother's voice, the way a salmon recognizes the stream of its birth, the way a plant recognizes the presence of light. It recognizes it as communication. It recognizes it as contact. It recognizes it as the unmistakable signature of intelligence. Now, the very suggestion that there might be an intelligence hiding inside what we call coincidence, that synchronicity might be a form of language, a mode of communication emanating from some vast and incomprehensible source. This suggestion is enough to make the guardians of respectable thought reach for their smelling salts. We have spent centuries, after all, constructing a picture of reality in which such notions are not merely false, but absurd, not merely mistaken, but embarrassing. The modern worldview, the worldview that we absorb through every pore from the moment we enter the education system, holds as its central dogma that consciousness is an accident, that meaning is a human projection, that the universe is a vast machine grinding forward according to physical laws that neither know nor care that we exist. In this picture, the very idea that reality might be trying to tell us something is a category error of the most basic kind. Machines do not speak. Accidents do not mean. The universe does not notice us because there is no universe to do the noticing. There are only particles and forces, mindlessly colliding according to mathematical equations that were discovered but not invented by the human mind. This is the story we have been told. This is the story that educated people are supposed to believe. And if this story were true, if reality were in fact the dead, mechanical, meaningless assemblage of matter that official science describes, then synchronicity would indeed be nothing more than coincidence. The meaningful connections we perceive would be illusions, patterns projected by a pattern-seeking brain onto the random noise of an indifferent cosmos. We would be, as the story goes, the only minds in a mindless universe, flickering briefly into existence before being extinguished forever, our lives signifying nothing to no one except ourselves. But here is what I want to suggest to you. Here is the possibility I want to place before you, like a gift wrapped in thorns. The story is not true. The story has never been true. The story is itself a kind of hallucination, a mass hypnosis, a consensus trance that we have mistaken for reality because everyone around us is participating in the same dream. And synchronicity, the phenomenon we have been taught to dismiss, to explain away, to actively forget. Synchronicity is one of the places where the dream springs leaks. It is one of the places where something else, something realer, something more intelligent and more alive, bleeds through. Terence McKenna understood this. He understood it not as a theory or a belief or a philosophical position, but as a lived reality, as an ongoing conversation with something that most people spend their entire lives refusing to acknowledge. He called it by different names at different times: the logos, the overmind, the transcendental object at the end of time. But beneath all these names was a single recognition: that consciousness is not an accidental byproduct of matter, but is in some sense primary, fundamental, woven into the very fabric of what is. And if consciousness is primary, if mind is in some way the ground of being rather than its late and local exception, then suddenly synchronicity makes sense. Suddenly the meaningful coincidences that punctuate our lives are not glitches in the machine, but communications from the depths, messages from the intelligence that we ourselves are expressions of, invitations to remember what we have been so carefully taught to forget. The question, then, is not whether synchronicity is real. Anyone who pays attention knows that it is real. The question is what we are going to do with that knowledge. Are we going to continue pretending that these moments are meaningless, continue stuffing them into the category of coincidence like embarrassing relatives we'd rather not acknowledge? Or are we going to take them seriously? Are we going to treat them as data, as evidence, as clues to the actual nature of the reality we inhabit? Because if we do, if we actually muster the courage to take synchronicity seriously, then everything changes. The world we thought we knew dissolves, and in its place something stranger, something wilder, something infinitely more alive begins to take shape. This is the threshold we are standing at. This is the door that synchronicity opens. And once you walk through it, once you genuinely begin to notice the intelligence hiding inside coincidence, you cannot walk back. You cannot unknow what you have come to know. You cannot unsee what you have begun to see. The only question is whether you are ready, whether you are willing to let go of the small and manageable world you have been given in exchange for the vast and terrifying and beautiful world that has been waiting for you all along. Let us walk through the door together. Let us see what we find on the other side. The world that most of us inhabit most of the time is a world built on a particular foundation, a foundation so pervasive and so invisible that we rarely think to question it. This foundation is the assumption that reality is made of matter, that matter is fundamentally dead, and that mind, consciousness, awareness, the felt sense of being someone having an experience, is a kind of fortunate accident that arises when matter is arranged in certain complex configurations. In this view, which we might call the materialist consensus, the universe began as a hot, dense point of energy that exploded outward, cooling and condensing into galaxies and stars and planets, and at some point on at least one of these planets, matter happened to organize itself in such a way that it began to have experiences. But this experiencing, this consciousness, is a late arrival on the cosmic scene, a thin film of subjectivity floating on an ocean of objective thingness. And when the particular arrangement of matter that produces any given consciousness is disrupted, when the brain ceases to function, when the heart stops beating, when the organism dies, the consciousness that depended on that arrangement simply ceases to exist. Game over. Thanks for playing. There is no ghost in the machine, because there is no ghost and there is no machine. There is only matter, only physics, only the blind and purposeless churning of particles, according to laws that have no interest in whether we live or die, suffer or flourish, exist or do not exist. This is the view that we have been handed. This is the view that underlies virtually all of modern education, modern medicine, modern economics, modern politics. It is the unspoken assumption behind the newspapers and the scientific journals, behind the laws and the textbooks, behind the way we structure our cities and our lives. And precisely because it is so pervasive, precisely because it is assumed rather than argued, we rarely stop to notice how strange it is. We rarely stop to notice that this view asks us to believe something truly extraordinary, that the felt sense of being, the most immediate, the most undeniable, the most present reality we have ever known, or will ever know, is somehow a secondary phenomenon, an epiphenomenon, a byproduct of processes that are themselves utterly devoid of experience. We are asked to believe that consciousness emerges from unconsciousness, that mind arises from mindlessness, that the inner light that illuminates our every waking moment is somehow generated by arrangements of matter that have no inner light of their own. Put this way, the materialist view begins to look less like a sober and scientific conclusion and more like a particularly ambitious metaphysical speculation. And when we examine the actual evidence for this view, when we ask what experiments have demonstrated that consciousness is produced by the brain, what observations have confirmed that mind is nothing but the activity of neurons, we find something surprising. We find that there are no such experiments. There are no such observations. What we find instead is a correlation. Certain brain states are correlated with certain conscious experiences. Damage to certain brain regions is correlated with changes in awareness, in personality, in cognitive function. But correlation is not causation. Correlation tells us that two things are connected. It does not tell us which one produces the other, or whether both are produced by something else entirely. Consider the analogy of a television set. If you damage the television, the picture becomes distorted. If you destroy the television, the picture disappears entirely. Someone who knew nothing about television technology might conclude that the television produces the picture, that the picture is generated by the electronic components inside the set. But we know that this conclusion would be false. The picture is not produced by the television. The picture is received by the television. It is transmitted from somewhere else, and the television is simply the instrument through which it becomes visible. The correlation between the state of the television and the quality of the picture is real, but the causal story is different from what a naive observer might assume. Now, I am not saying that the brain is like a television. I am not proposing a simple transmission theory of consciousness. What I am saying is that the relationship between brain and mind is far more mysterious, far more open to interpretation than the materialist consensus would have us believe. And this matters enormously for how we think about synchronicity. Because if consciousness is truly just a product of matter, if mind is really nothing more than the activity of neurons, then synchronicity can only be coincidence. There can be no intelligence hiding inside it, because intelligence is rare and local and fragile, locked away inside the skulls of biological organisms and nowhere else. But if consciousness is something more, if mind is in some way fundamental to the nature of reality rather than derivative of it, then suddenly the door opens to possibilities that the materialist worldview cannot accommodate. Suddenly it becomes conceivable that the meaningful connections we perceive are not projections, but perceptions, not illusions, but intimations of a deeper order. Terence McKenna was relentlessly critical of the materialist worldview, not because he rejected science, but because he saw materialism as a philosophy masquerading as science. The scientific method is a tool for investigating reality, a set of procedures for testing hypotheses and refining our understanding. Materialism is a metaphysical assumption about the nature of reality, an assumption that cannot itself be tested by scientific methods. And McKenna saw with unusual clarity that this assumption had become invisible, had become confused with science itself, so that questioning materialism felt like questioning the findings of physics, or chemistry, or biology, rather than questioning an interpretive framework that had been draped over those findings like a shroud. What McKenna proposed in place of materialism was not a return to naive supernaturalism, not a simple-minded theism that posited a bearded deity intervening in the natural order. What he proposed was something more subtle and more radical, the recognition that nature itself is intelligent. Not intelligent in the way that a human being is intelligent, not possessing a single unified perspective, not reflecting on itself in the manner of the rational ego, but intelligent in a broader sense, intelligent in the sense of being organized according to principles that transcend mere mechanical causation, intelligent in the sense of being responsive to consciousness, intelligent in the sense of exhibiting purposes and meanings that cannot be reduced to the blind shuffling of particles. This intelligence, McKenna suggested, is not something supernatural added to nature from outside. It is nature itself, seen truly for the first time. It is what nature has always been, hidden in plain sight, obscured only by the conceptual blinders that materialist culture has placed over our eyes. And synchronicity, the phenomenon that seems so anomalous, so inexplicable, so embarrassing to the modern mind, synchronicity is one of the primary ways that this intelligence makes itself felt. It is the signature of a living cosmos, the calling card of a universe that knows we are here and is, in its own strange way, trying to communicate with us. But why would a living cosmos communicate through coincidence? Why would an intelligent nature speak in the language of meaningful happenstance rather than in clear and unmistakable declarations? Part of the answer, I think, lies in the nature of meaning itself. Meaning is not something that can be conveyed by force. It cannot be imposed from outside. It must be recognized from within. If the intelligence at the heart of reality were to communicate with us in ways that left no room for doubt, in ways that compelled belief rather than inviting recognition, something essential would be lost. We would become passive recipients rather than active participants. We would have information, but not understanding. We would know that something was there, but we would not know what it meant to us, how it related to the particular circumstances of our particular lives. Synchronicity operates differently. It arrives at the intersection of the objective and the subjective, at the point where the outer world and the inner life meet. A synchronistic event is meaningful precisely because it speaks to where we are, to what we are grappling with, to questions we have been asking or have been afraid to ask. It cannot be separated from the consciousness that perceives it without losing its essence. And this is why synchronicity has the character of a language rather than a lecture, a conversation rather than a command. It invites us to participate. It requires our attention, our reflection, our willingness to engage. It will not force itself upon us. It can only offer itself to those who have developed the eyes to see. And this brings us to a crucial point. If synchronicity is a form of communication, if meaningful coincidence is the language through which an intelligent universe speaks, then the question of why most people do not notice this language becomes paramount. It is not that synchronicities are rare. They are happening all the time, to everyone, in every life. But most people do not see them. Most people are too busy, too distracted, too thoroughly conditioned by the materialist worldview to register what is actually occurring. They experience the coincidence, but they immediately translate it into the familiar category of chance. They feel the flicker of meaning, but they extinguish it almost instantaneously with the reflexive invocation of probability. And in doing so, they remain deaf to a conversation that has been going on all around them and within them since the moment they were born. This is what it means to be asleep, in the sense that mystics and shamans and visionaries have always used that word. It is not a literal sleep, not an absence of waking consciousness. It is something subtler and more pervasive, a kind of waking dream, a state of consciousness in which we are present but not truly present, aware but not truly aware, alive but not truly alive. And the first step toward waking up, the first crack in the shell of the consensus trance, is often a synchronicity too striking to ignore. It is the moment when the language of the universe becomes, just for an instant, impossible to dismiss. And in that moment, everything hangs in the balance. We can retreat back into sleep, back into the comforting numbness of the materialist worldview. Or we can lean into the strangeness, can follow the thread of meaning wherever it leads, can begin the long and disorienting process of learning to read a language we never knew we had forgotten. Language is a strange and miraculous thing. We use it so constantly, so automatically, that we rarely stop to consider what an extraordinary achievement it represents. Every time we speak, every time we write, every time we formulate a thought in words, we are engaging in an act of translation. We are taking something that exists in the realm of experience, a perception, an emotion, a sense of meaning, and we are encoding it into a sequence of sounds or marks that can be transmitted through space and time to another mind, where it is decoded back into something resembling the original experience. The fact that this works at all, the fact that we can share our inner lives with one another through the medium of language, is so remarkable that we should probably fall to our knees in astonishment every time a sentence is successfully communicated. But language does more than communicate. Language shapes. Language constructs. Language determines, to a degree we rarely appreciate, what we are capable of perceiving, thinking, and experiencing. The limits of my language, as Wittgenstein famously observed, are the limits of my world. We cannot think clearly about things for which we have no words. We cannot perceive distinctions that our language does not mark. We cannot inhabit conceptual spaces that our vocabulary has not opened up for us. This is why learning a new language is always more than learning a new code for expressing the same old thoughts. It is an expansion of the mind itself, an enlargement of the territory of the thinkable, a discovery of new rooms in the mansion of consciousness. Now, the languages we learn as children, English, Spanish, Mandarin, whatever tongue we happen to be born into, these are human languages. They were developed by human communities over thousands of years to serve human purposes. They allow us to communicate about the world as human beings experience it, to coordinate human activities, to share human concerns. And they do this extraordinarily well. But what if there are other languages? What if there are modes of communication that predate humanity, that exceed humanity, that operate according to principles entirely different from the sequential, symbolic logic of human speech? What if the universe itself has a language, not a language made of words, not a language that can be captured in dictionaries or grammars, but a language of correspondence, of resonance, of meaningful connection across gaps that should be unbridgeable? This is what McKenna was pointing toward when he spoke of synchronicity as the universe's way of speaking. He understood that we are embedded in a communicative matrix far larger and far older than human civilization. He understood that nature is not silent, that reality is not mute, but that we have lost, or have been trained to lose, the capacity to hear what is being said. We are like people who have been raised in soundproof rooms, who have never heard music, who cannot imagine that the air itself might be full of vibrations carrying meaning. And then one day, somehow, a crack appears in the walls of our room, and for just a moment we hear something, a fragment of melody, a snatch of song, and everything we thought we knew about the silence of the world is called into question. The language of synchronicity is not like human language. It does not proceed according to the rules of logic and syntax. It does not build arguments or tell stories in the linear way that we are accustomed to. Instead, it operates through what we might call semantic resonance, the creation of meaningful echoes between events that have no causal connection. It speaks through the rhyming of circumstances, the punning of situations, the metaphorical correspondence between what happens out there in the world and what is happening in here, in the depths of the psyche. And because it operates in this way, because it does not conform to our expectations of what communication should look like, we tend not to recognize it as communication at all. We experience it as coincidence. We experience it as chance. We experience it as noise rather than signal. But consider for a moment what it would mean for the universe to communicate in this way. Consider what it implies about the nature of reality. If synchronicity is real, if meaningful coincidences are genuine communications rather than random correlations, then the universe must be organized in a way that makes such communications possible. There must be connections between things that transcend physical causation. There must be relationships between events that are not mediated by energy or matter or the known forces of physics. There must be, in short, a dimension of reality that we have not yet mapped, a layer of the world that our current science has not yet learned to see. Carl Jung, who introduced the concept of synchronicity to the Western psychological vocabulary, was acutely aware of this implication. He proposed that synchronicity revealed the existence of what he called an acausal connecting principle, a mode of connection between events that was not causal in the ordinary sense, but was nonetheless real, nonetheless operative, nonetheless significant. Jung grounded this idea in his understanding of the collective unconscious, the vast reservoir of archetypal patterns that underlies individual human consciousness. For Jung, synchronicities occurred when an archetype was activated, when some deep pattern in the collective unconscious was constellated, and the activation of this pattern created corresponding events in both the inner and outer worlds simultaneously. The meaningful coincidence was not a cause leading to an effect. It was a single pattern expressing itself in multiple domains at once. McKenna took this insight further. Where Jung remained somewhat cautious, somewhat reluctant to extend his ideas beyond the domain of psychology, McKenna was willing to follow the implications wherever they led. If synchronicity reveals an acausal connecting principle, if meaningful coincidences demonstrate that there are modes of connection that transcend physical causation, then we are living in a very different universe than the one described by materialist science. We are living in a universe that is, in some fundamental sense, mind-like. We are living in a universe where meaning is not a human projection, but an ontological feature, a basic characteristic of reality itself. This is the logos that McKenna spoke of, the divine intelligence that speaks through the fabric of events, the cosmic mind that expresses itself through the patterning of synchronicities. The word logos comes from ancient Greek, where it meant something like word, or reason, or ordering principle. For the Greek philosophers, the logos was the rational structure that underlies the apparent chaos of the world, the hidden order that makes the universe a cosmos rather than a chaos. For the early Christians, the logos became identified with Christ, the divine word made flesh, the expression of God's intelligence in human form. For McKenna, the logos was something both older and newer than either of these traditions suggested. It was the living intelligence at the heart of nature, the mind behind the mushroom, the voice that speaks when we finally learn to listen. And when the logos speaks, it speaks in the language of synchronicity. It speaks in the language of meaningful coincidence. It speaks not in words, but in events, not in propositions, but in situations, not in arguments, but in experiences that carry their own unmistakable stamp of significance. And learning to understand this language, learning to read the text that reality itself is writing, is one of the great tasks of human awakening. It is not a matter of believing certain doctrines or accepting certain propositions. It is a matter of developing a new capacity for perception, of opening an eye that has been closed for too long, of tuning an ear that has forgotten how to hear. How does one learn this language? There is no textbook for it. There is no course one can take, no certificate one can earn. But there are practices that help. There is, first and most importantly, attention. The language of synchronicity cannot be heard by a mind that is elsewhere, by a consciousness that is scattered across 1,000 distractions. It requires presence. It requires the cultivation of a certain quality of awareness, alert, receptive, neither grasping nor rejecting, simply open to what is. The great contemplative traditions of the world have developed sophisticated techniques for cultivating this quality of attention, and there is much wisdom to be gathered from them. Meditation, properly understood, is not a withdrawal from the world, but a deepening into it, a refinement of the capacity to perceive what is actually happening. There is also, McKenna would insist, the question of substances. The plants and fungi that indigenous cultures have used for millennia to communicate with the spirit world, psilocybin mushrooms, ayahuasca, peyote, and others. These are not merely drugs in the modern sense of the word. They are not chemical entertainments or pharmacological escapes. They are, in McKenna's view, technologies of communication, tools for opening the channels through which the Logos speaks. Under the influence of these substances, the language of synchronicity becomes deafeningly loud. The meaningful connections that ordinarily slip past unnoticed become overwhelming, inescapable, impossible to dismiss. One experiences directly, in the undeniable immediacy of present moment awareness, that reality is alive, that it is speaking, that it has been speaking all along. This is not to say that psychedelics are necessary for hearing the language of the universe. There are many who have developed the capacity to perceive synchronicity without any chemical assistance, through practices of meditation, through the intensity of creative work, through the natural deepening that sometimes comes with age or suffering or love. But psychedelics offer a shortcut, a fast track, a way of demonstrating to the doubting mind that there is indeed something to be heard. They show, with the force of direct experience, that the materialist worldview is not the whole story, that there is more going on here than dead matter shuffling randomly through empty space. And once you have heard the language, even once, everything changes. You cannot unhear it. You cannot go back to the comfortable assumption that reality is silent, that the universe is meaningless, that coincidence is just coincidence. The door has been opened, the channel has been established, and from that point forward, you live in a different world, a world that is speaking to you, a world that is in some mysterious way aware of you, a world that invites your participation in a dialogue that has been going on since the beginning of time. There is a peculiar feature of synchronicity that deserves our careful attention, a feature that distinguishes it from ordinary causation and places it in a category all its own. This feature is the role of the observer. In ordinary causal processes, the kind that physics describes with such precision, the observer is irrelevant to what happens. A rock falls whether or not anyone is watching. A chemical reaction proceeds according to the same laws, regardless of who is in the laboratory. The observer can measure and record and calculate, but the observer's presence does not change the phenomenon being observed. This is one of the foundational assumptions of objective science, that the world exists independently of our awareness of it, that reality proceeds on its course regardless of whether we are paying attention. But synchronicity does not work this way. Synchronicity is constitutively dependent on the observer. A meaningful coincidence is meaningful to someone. It is not a property of the events themselves, considered in isolation, but a property that emerges in the relationship between events and the consciousness that perceives them. Remove the observer, and you do not have a synchronicity. You have merely two events that happen to occur in proximity. The meaning, which is the whole point, the essence, the soul of the synchronistic experience, exists only in the space between the event and the awareness that registers it. This is a profound clue to the nature of reality, and it connects synchronicity to one of the strangest findings of modern physics, the observer effect in quantum mechanics. At the subatomic level, the behavior of particles seems to depend on whether and how they are observed. The famous double-slit experiment demonstrates that particles behave differently when they are being measured than when they are not, as if they know whether someone is watching, as if the presence of consciousness changes what happens in the physical world. This is deeply disturbing to the materialist worldview, because it suggests that consciousness is not merely a passive witness to reality, but an active participant in shaping it. It suggests that the observer and the observed are entangled in ways that classical physics cannot accommodate. Now, we must be careful here. The quantum observer effect is a subtle and much debated phenomenon, and it would be too simple to say that quantum mechanics proves that consciousness creates reality. The relationship between measurement, observation, and quantum behavior is more complex than such formulations suggest. But what we can say, what even the most cautious interpreters must acknowledge, is that quantum mechanics has introduced a crack in the edifice of purely objective science. It has shown that the assumption of an observer-independent reality, an assumption that seemed so obvious, so unquestionable, may not hold at the most fundamental levels of physical existence. And this crack, this fissure in the foundations of materialism, is precisely where synchronicity becomes comprehensible. McKenna was fascinated by the resonances between quantum physics and the shamanic worldview. He saw in quantum mechanics a kind of scientific confirmation of insights that indigenous cultures had preserved for millennia. Insights about the participatory nature of reality, the entanglement of mind and matter, the responsiveness of the world to the consciousness that engages it. For the shaman, the world is not an object to be studied from outside. It is a living presence to be encountered, a partner in an ongoing dialogue, a responsive matrix that answers when addressed properly. And this shamanic understanding, which materialist science had dismissed as primitive superstition, suddenly found an unexpected echo in the equations of quantum physics. Synchronicity, in this light, can be understood as a macroscopic manifestation of quantum-like principles. It is what happens when the observer effect scales up from the subatomic realm to the level of everyday experience. Just as the act of measurement affects the behavior of particles, so the act of attention affects the patterning of events. Just as the observer is entangled with the observed in quantum experiments, so the conscious self is entangled with the meaningful coincidences that punctuate its life. Reality, at every scale, is responsive to awareness. Mind and world are not separate domains accidentally conjoined. They are aspects of a single process, mutually arising, intimately interconnected. This has practical implications for how we engage with synchronicity. If synchronicity depends on the observer, if meaningful coincidence is constituted by the relationship between events and the consciousness that perceives them, then our mode of attention matters enormously. The quality of our awareness shapes the quality of our experience. A scattered, distracted, superficial mode of consciousness will register few synchronicities, will live in a world that seems random and meaningless. A focused, present, receptive mode of consciousness will register many synchronicities, will live in a world that seems alive with significance. The world has not changed in these two cases. The observer has changed, and with the observer, the world that appears. This is not merely a psychological point about subjective experience. It is an ontological point about the nature of reality. If consciousness participates in constituting what is real, then what is real cannot be separated from how we attend to it. The universe we inhabit is not a fixed entity waiting to be discovered. It is a dynamic process of mutual arising, a dance of observer and observed, a co-creation of mind and matter. And synchronicity is one of the names for the steps of this dance, one of the modes through which the partnership manifests. But here, we must confront a puzzle that has troubled thinkers about synchronicity since Jung first introduced the concept. If synchronicity depends on the observer, does that mean it is subjective? Does that mean it is merely psychological, a matter of how we interpret events, rather than a feature of events themselves? This would seem to deflate the whole significance of the phenomenon, to reduce it to a kind of confirmation bias, a pattern-seeking tendency of the human mind that finds meaning where none exists. This puzzle, I think, rests on a false dichotomy, the dichotomy between objective and subjective, between the real and the perceived. This dichotomy is itself a product of the materialist worldview, which assumes that reality is fundamentally objective and that subjectivity is a secondary phenomenon, a kind of film or distortion overlaid on the real. But if we abandon this assumption, if we recognize that consciousness is primary, that mind is not an exception to reality, but an expression of it, then the dichotomy dissolves. The meaningful coincidence is neither purely objective nor purely subjective. It is both. It is the place where the distinction between objective and subjective breaks down, where we are invited to recognize that these categories, so fundamental to our ordinary thinking, do not ultimately apply. McKenna often spoke of reality as a kind of linguistic structure, a pattern of meanings rather than a collection of things. In this view, the material world is not the fundamental layer of existence. It is more like a precipitation, a crystallization, a condensation of something deeper and more primary. And that deeper something is semantic. It is made of meaning rather than matter. Or more precisely, matter is congealed meaning, meaning that has become dense enough to resist and persist. If this is true, and synchronicity suggests that it is, then finding meaning in events is not imposing something foreign onto them. It is recognizing what they already are. It is reading the text that reality is constantly writing. The practice of attending to synchronicity, then, is not a flight from reality into fantasy. It is a deeper engagement with reality than ordinary consciousness permits. It is an act of recognition, an acknowledgement of the semantic texture of existence. And this recognition, once it takes hold, transforms everything. The world that seemed so solid, so fixed, so indifferent to our presence, reveals itself as fluid, responsive, alive with intelligence. We are not isolated minds trapped in a meaningless mechanism. We are participants in a meaningful whole, expressions of an intelligence that expresses itself through us. This is what awakening means in the context of synchronicity. It is not the acquisition of new beliefs or the achievement of exotic states of consciousness. It is simply the recognition of what has always been the case. The intelligence hiding inside coincidence has always been there. The language of the universe has always been speaking. What changes is our capacity to perceive it, our willingness to attend, our readiness to participate in the dialogue that reality perpetually invites. And once this recognition dawns, once we begin to live in conscious relationship with the synchronistic dimension of experience, something strange happens. The synchronicities increase. They become more frequent, more striking, more impossible to dismiss. It is as if reality rewards attention, as if the language of the universe grows louder the more carefully we listen. This is the great secret of synchronicity. It responds to engagement. It is not a fixed frequency that we either tune into or don't. It is a living process that deepens and intensifies as we participate in it. The more we attend, the more there is to attend to. The more we listen, the more we hear. There is a moment in the journey of awakening, and awakening is always a journey, never a single event, when what was once extraordinary becomes ordinary. Not ordinary in the sense of losing its significance, but ordinary in the sense of becoming the new baseline, the everyday texture of experience. The synchronicities that once shocked us, that once stopped us in our tracks with their impossible precision, become something we simply live with, something we navigate by, something as natural and expected as the rising of the sun or the changing of the seasons. This is a strange transition to undergo. On the one hand, it might seem like a loss, the thrill of the initial recognitions, the vertigo of having one's worldview shattered, the exhilaration of discovering that reality is alive. These cannot be sustained indefinitely at their initial intensity. The nervous system that could handle perpetual astonishment would not be a human nervous system. We adapt, we integrate. What was once revelation becomes background. But on the other hand, this normalization is the whole point. The goal was never to have mystical experiences. The goal was to become someone for whom reality is inherently mystical. The goal was never to perceive occasional synchronicities against a backdrop of meaningless coincidence. The goal was to live in a world where meaning is the fundamental substance, where significance saturates every moment, where the intelligence hiding inside coincidence is recognized as hiding inside everything. The normalization of synchronicity is not a falling off from the heights of awakening. It is the completion of awakening, its fruition, its embodiment in the living tissue of daily existence. McKenna spoke often about the importance of not becoming addicted to peak experiences, not chasing the extraordinary at the expense of the quietly miraculous ordinary. The psychedelic experience, he observed, is most valuable not for what it is in itself, but for what it shows about the nature of reality, a nature that remains true whether or not we are currently under the influence of any substance. The point of the vision is to transform the seeing, to change forever what it means to open your eyes on a Tuesday morning. And synchronicity teaches the same lesson. The point is not to collect synchronicities like souvenirs, not to recount them as stories of one's own specialness, but to allow them to restructure one's entire relationship with the real. What does it mean to live in this way? What does daily existence look like when synchronicity has become the medium of one's life rather than an occasional interruption of it? Let me try to describe it, knowing that any description will fall short of the living reality. First, there is a quality of attention that becomes habitual, a mode of awareness that remains alert to meaning even in the most mundane circumstances. Waiting in line at the grocery store, stuck in traffic, listening to a colleague's routine complaint. These situations, which once seemed empty of significance, become potential sites of communication. Not because one forces meaning onto them, not because one hallucinates significance where none exists, but because one has learned that meaning is everywhere, that the intelligence of the universe does not confine itself to dramatic moments and exotic locations. The language is always being spoken. The question is only whether we are listening. Second, there is a transformation in how one makes decisions. The conventional approach to decision-making treats it as a process of rational calculation, gathering information, weighing pros and cons, projecting outcomes, and selecting the option that best serves one's interests. And rational calculation has its place. It would be foolish to abandon it entirely. But alongside this process, and sometimes superseding it, there develops a sensitivity to what we might call the grain of reality. One learns to feel when something is aligned, when a path is opening, when the universe is saying yes. And one learns to feel the opposite as well, the subtle resistance, the slight wrongness, the sense that pushing forward in a certain direction is pushing against something larger than oneself. This is not superstition or passivity or an abdication of responsibility. It is a more sophisticated form of engagement, a recognition that reality has preferences, that certain possibilities are more supported than others, and that attending to these preferences is a form of wisdom. Third, there is a change in one's relationship to time. The conventional experience of time is linear and progressive. The past is gone, the present is a knife edge, the future is yet to come. Events succeed one another in a single direction, and causality flows only forward. But synchronicity suggests a different topology. If events can be meaningfully connected without being causally connected, if a dream tonight can rhyme with an event tomorrow, if a thought in my mind can correspond to an occurrence in the world, then time is not the simple one-way street we imagine it to be. There are connections that cut across time, resonances that link past and future and present in patterns that transcend sequence. Living with synchronicity means inhabiting this more complex temporality, sensing the echoes and anticipations that weave through the apparent linearity of events. Fourth, and this may be the most important transformation of all, there is a fundamental shift in one's sense of self. The conventional self, the ego that we spend so much energy constructing and defending, is predicated on separation. I am here, inside this body. The world is there, outside. My thoughts are private, your thoughts are unknown. We are isolated monads, bumping against each other in the dark, communicating through the narrow channels of language and gesture. But synchronicity dissolves this separation. If my inner life and the outer world can correspond in meaningful ways, if the boundaries between what is me and what is not me are not as solid as they seemed, then the self that I thought I was cannot be the whole story. There is something larger happening, something that includes but exceeds the individual ego, something that expresses itself through me without being identical to me. This is what the mystics have always reported. This is what the perennial philosophy, in all its variations, has tried to convey. The sense of being a separate self, an isolated consciousness confronting an alien world, is not the ultimate truth of our situation. It is a construction, a useful fiction, a developmental stage that served important purposes, but that is not the final word. Awakening, in every tradition that speaks of it, involves seeing through this fiction, recognizing the larger reality of which we are expressions, and reorienting one's life accordingly. Synchronicity is one of the doors through which this recognition becomes possible. It is, in a sense, an empirical mysticism, a form of awakening grounded not in belief or doctrine, but in direct observation of how reality actually behaves. When you notice the intelligence hiding inside coincidence, you are noticing something about the nature of what is. You are gathering evidence, testing hypotheses, refining your understanding based on experience, and the conclusion that this evidence supports, the hypothesis that it confirms, is precisely the conclusion that mystics have reached through very different means, that consciousness and reality are not separate, that meaning is not imposed but inherent, that we are participants in something vastly larger than our individual lives. But let me be honest about the costs. Awakening to synchronicity is not all wonder and enchantment. There is a price to be paid, and anyone contemplating this path should know what they are signing up for. The price is certainty. The price is the comfortable smallness of the materialist worldview, which may have been false but at least made sense. The price is the ability to dismiss, to explain away, to return to the cozy assumption that reality is simple and straightforward and requires nothing of us beyond ordinary effort. Once you have seen, you cannot unsee. Once you have recognized the intelligence, you cannot pretend it isn't there. And this means living with a constant low-grade astonishment that can be exhausting. It means recognizing that you do not understand what is happening, that the reality you are embedded in is far stranger than any story you have been told about it. It means giving up the illusion of control that the ego clings to, acknowledging that you are being lived at least as much as you are living. For some people, this is unbearable. They glimpse the abyss and they turn back. They have a synchronistic experience that shakes them to their foundations, and they spend the rest of their lives carefully not thinking about it, building thicker walls, defending more fiercely the worldview that those moments called into question. This is a legitimate response. Not everyone is called to walk through the door. Not everyone is willing to pay the price of admission. But for those who do walk through, for those who accept the cost and embrace the strangeness, something becomes available that is worth more than all the certainty in the world. It is the felt sense of being in relationship with the real, of mattering to a cosmos that knows you are here, of participating in something that did not begin with your birth and will not end with your death. It is what the religious traditions call grace, what the poets call inspiration, what the lovers call union. It is the experience of being held by an intelligence that exceeds you, guided by a wisdom that you could never have generated on your own. This is what waits on the other side of the door. This is what synchronicity is inviting you toward. Not a belief system, not a set of propositions to accept on faith, but a lived relationship with a living reality. The intelligence hiding inside coincidence is not hiding because it wants to remain undiscovered. It is hiding in plain sight, waiting for the eyes that can see it, waiting for the hearts that can recognize it, waiting for the minds that can finally, after all these years of slumber, wake up and say, I see you, I hear you, I am here. We have come a long way together, through territories that most maps do not chart, and now we stand at the place where all such journeys must eventually arrive, the question of what to do with what we have seen. Knowledge that does not transform is not truly knowledge. It is merely information, data points filed away in some cabinet of the mind, affecting nothing, changing nothing. The recognition of synchronicity, the awakening to the intelligence that pervades reality, will either become the foundation of a new way of living, or it will fade back into the general noise of accumulated ideas. One more interesting thing we thought about once upon a time. So let us be practical. Let us be concrete. What does it mean to live in conscious relationship with a synchronistic universe? What practices, what orientations, what shifts in habit and attention does this awakening call for? The first and most fundamental practice is what we might call attentive receptivity. This is not passive waiting, it is active listening. It is the cultivation of a quality of awareness that remains open to what is, that does not prejudge what can happen or what is worth noticing, that treats each moment as potentially significant without grasping at significance or forcing meaning where none arises naturally. This sounds simple, but it is extraordinarily difficult, especially in a culture that trains us from infancy in the opposite direction, in distraction, in hurry, in the mechanical processing of experience according to preset categories. To become attentively receptive requires deprogramming. It requires unlearning the habits of inattention that we have been schooled in for decades. There are many techniques that can assist this unlearning. Meditation practices of various kinds slow down the rushing mind and create space for perception. Time in nature, away from the constant stimulation of human-made environments, recalibrates the nervous system and reminds us what undistracted awareness feels like. Journaling, the daily practice of recording what happened and what it might mean, trains the mind to notice and remember the moments that would otherwise slip away unregistered. And of course, for those who are called to them, the visionary plants and fungi that McKenna championed can blast through the accumulated defenses of ordinary consciousness and show us directly how much we have been missing. But techniques are not enough. There must also be what we could call a revision of expectation, a fundamental shift in what we believe is possible. As long as we hold, consciously or unconsciously, to the materialist assumption that synchronicity is impossible, we will find ways to dismiss or ignore the synchronicities that occur. The mind that believes the universe is dead matter will interpret all experience in light of that belief, filtering out the evidence that contradicts it. This is not dishonesty. It is simply how belief systems work. We see what we expect to see. We find what we are looking for. And if we are looking for meaninglessness, we will find it everywhere. Revising this expectation does not mean adopting a naive credulity, seeing significance in every falling leaf and every random number. It means opening to the genuine possibility that meaning might be present, that intelligence might be at work, that what seems like coincidence might be something more. It means suspending the automatic dismissal long enough to actually look at what is happening. It means treating synchronicity as a hypothesis worth testing, rather than a superstition to be rejected out of hand. And when you treat it this way, when you genuinely open to the possibility, you will find that the evidence accumulates. The coincidences become too numerous, too precise, too personally relevant to explain away. The hypothesis confirms itself in lived experience. Beyond these individual practices, there is also the question of community. The awakening to synchronicity can be a lonely path. The consensus reality does not support it. The people around you, friends, family, colleagues, may have no framework for understanding what you are experiencing, may actively discourage you from taking it seriously, may even question your sanity. This is painful, and it is why communities of the like-minded matter so much. Not echo chambers that confirm everything you want to believe, but genuine communities of inquiry where experiences can be shared, questions can be asked, and understanding can be deepened through dialogue. Such communities have always existed at the margins of culture: mystery schools, esoteric orders, circles of seekers gathered around teachers and texts. Today, they take new forms, online and offline, and finding your way to them is part of the work. And then there is the deepest dimension of practice, which is not really a practice at all, but an orientation of the heart: trust. To live in relationship with a synchronistic universe is to learn to trust that relationship. Not blind trust, not naivety, not the abandonment of discernment, but a basic confidence that meaning is at work, that intelligence is guiding, that you are not alone in the vast strangeness of existence. This trust does not come all at once. It develops through accumulated experience, through the repeated demonstration that when you follow the synchronicities, when you attend to what reality seems to be saying, things work out in ways you could not have predicted or arranged. You begin to sense that you are being guided, not controlled, not puppeted, but guided, the way a river guides a boat that knows how to yield to the current. McKenna lived this trust. He followed the strange attractors that he perceived in his own experience, the intimations and intuitions and visions that pointed toward novel ideas and unexplored territories. He did not always know where he was going, but he trusted the process, trusted the intelligence that was communicating through the medium of his life. And this trust allowed him to become a channel for something larger than himself, to speak with a voice that carried more than his individual knowledge, to touch people in ways that changed their lives. This is what becomes possible when we stop fighting the current and start learning to navigate it. We become vehicles for something. We become expressions of the intelligence that we have learned to perceive. We stop trying to impose our small agendas on a universe that has agendas of its own, and we start cooperating with what wants to happen, with what is trying to emerge, with the novel configurations that are always pressing into being at the edge of the possible. I want to be clear that this is not passivity. This is not quietism or fatalism or the abandonment of agency. The ego that relaxes its grip is not dissolved, it is transformed. It becomes a more effective instrument precisely because it is no longer fighting against the grain of reality. The intelligence that guides synchronicities does not override our will. It works through our will, shapes our intentions, informs our choices, leads us toward possibilities we would never have imagined for ourselves. The partnership is real. We bring something irreplaceable to it, our particularity, our history, our specific location in the web of being. And it brings something irreplaceable as well, a view of the whole, a wisdom that transcends our limited perspective, a knowledge of how the pieces fit together that we could never attain on our own. This is the invitation that synchronicity extends. This is what it means to finally notice the intelligence hiding inside coincidence, not just to notice it once, in a moment of startled recognition, but to build a life around that noticing, to let it permeate and transform everything. The universe is speaking. It has always been speaking. The language is strange. It is subtle. It operates according to principles we do not fully understand. But it is there. It is real. And it is waiting for us to learn to listen. Some of you who hear these words will dismiss them. You will file them under curiosity or delusion or New Age nonsense, and you will return to the worldview you inhabited before. That is your right and your choice. But some of you, perhaps many of you, will recognize something. You will feel a resonance, a correspondence, a meaningful connection between what you are hearing and what you have experienced but never known how to name. For you, these words are not new information, but old knowledge finally articulated. Something you knew before you knew it, now brought to the surface where it can be examined and claimed. If you are among this second group, then you stand at a threshold. The door is open. The intelligence that has been hiding inside coincidence is no longer hiding. It is looking directly at you, waiting to see what you will do. Will you walk through? Will you begin the long, strange, irreversible journey of awakening to what reality has been trying to tell you all along? The choice is yours. It has always been yours. But know this: the universe is patient. It has been sending you messages since you were born, in dreams, in coincidences, in those uncanny moments when the boundary between inner and outer momentarily dissolved. It will continue sending them whether or not you pay attention. The question is not whether the conversation is happening. The conversation is always happening. The question is whether you are finally ready to participate. I believe you are. I believe that is why you are here, hearing these words, at this moment, in whatever circumstances have conspired to bring us together. This is itself a synchronicity. This is itself part of the pattern. And if you can feel that, if you can sense, even faintly, the intelligence that has arranged for this meeting, then you already know what I have been trying to say. You already understand the language. You have always understood it. Now it is time to speak back. Now it is time to live the conversation. Now it is time to notice, truly notice, with everything you are, the intelligence that has been hiding inside coincidence, waiting for you to wake up. It is waiting still, but perhaps not for much longer.